The U.S. has officially pulled out from a nuclear treaty with Russia. The move kills off an agreement that's been in place for more than 3 decades and has raised fears of a new arms race.
The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed in 1987 between then U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. And the landmark pact was hailed as a key turning point in ending the Cold War.
It barred land-based medium-range conventional and nuclear missiles. This led to thousands of such missiles being mothballed. But things came under strain this year.
In February, the U.S. and NATO accused Russia of violating the treaty by deploying a new type of cruise missile. Moscow denied doing so, but the damage was done. The White House kicked off the 6-month departure process, and Russia suspended its own obligations shortly after.
And that withdrawal procedure has been completed today, and the UN has already warned of the consequences.
The world will lose an invaluable break on nuclear war, and this will likely not reduce the threat posed by ballistic missiles. Regardless of what transpires, the parties should avoid destabilizing developments and urgently seek agreement on a new common path for international arms control.
The demise of the INF Treaty means only one arms control treaty remains between the U.S. and Russia. Called New START, it limits the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads and establishes an inspection regime.
But New START is set to expire in 2 years' time, and strained ties between Washington and Moscow have led some to question whether it will be extended beyond that.
The U.S. and Russia have reacted to the death of the INF Treaty. Simon Marks joins us now to fill us in on Washington's response. Simon, the treaty gone, what does this mean for the United States?
Arms control experts here in Washington, D.C. are certainly in mourning over the demise of this treaty, signed in 1987, the only treaty that eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. And they make the point that it was signed by Ronald Reagan, a Republican president, based in large measure on enormous efforts by leading Republican members in Congress to find a way of reaching an agreement with their Soviet counterparts. So, without the INF Treaty, there are enormous questions about what the impact will be on other nuclear agreements, as we were just suggesting, that remain in place between the United States and Russia, and what can the Trump administration do to try and salvage the entire concept of nuclear arms control. Arms control experts here say they didn't see the kind of energetic action behind the scenes that they were hoping to see from President Trump's White House, especially from the National Security Administration, in a bid to try and salvage the INF Treaty. So they wonder just how committed the Trump administration is to the concept of arms control generally, even though it's not just the United States, its NATO partners also argue that Russia was in clear violation of the treaty.
Simon, Mr. Trump has also mentioned, though, a next-generation arms control with Russia and China to cover all types of nuclear weapons. What are the odds of that actually happening then?
Well, so one of the reasons why there may not have been much energy behind the scenes about saving the INF Treaty is that people like National Security Advisor John Bolton believe that it was ineffective because China wasn't part of it. And while it constrained Russia and the United States, it did nothing to constrain Chinese efforts in the nuclear space. So there has been talk about a possible next-generation arms control effort that would bring the Chinese within the fold. But as the United States heads towards its date with the next presidential election in November of next year, it's very hard to see how much immediate action takes place on that, and hard also to see how you get the leaders of America, Russia and China into a room to agree on anything at a time of curious relations between Washington and Moscow, and at the time of a trade war between Washington and Beijing.
All right, thanks, Simon. Simon Marks speaking to us from Washington, D.C. So let's bring in Julia Chapman for the reaction from Moscow right now. Julia, NATO has solely blamed Russia for the treaty's demise. What's been the Kremlin's response?
Well, Russia has repeatedly rejected that it has violated the INF Treaty over the last few years when the US and NATO have accused it of doing so. Today, the Foreign Ministry here in Moscow published a statement declaring the end of the INF Treaty, and it said that this was done at the initiative of the Americans. So Russia very much placing the blame for this treaty falling apart on the U.S. Russia says that its missiles have not been violating the treaty. It maintains that it has been in compliance this entire time, ever since it was signed between Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987. So Russia very much pointing the finger elsewhere, deflecting the blame, saying that the U.S. is in fact the country that has been violating this pact, and that is why it hasn't been saved in the last 6 months since the U.S. declared its intention to withdraw.
Well, there are fears that with the treaty gone, Europe could once again be in the hot seat, with both Washington and Moscow building up its nuclear arms there. But Russia seems to be trying to avert that.
It does indeed. Russia very publicly has said that it does not want to build up of arms in Europe. It doesn't want to see a new arms race between Russia and the U.S. But publicly, people here have been commenting, saying they're finding it very difficult to negotiate with the U.S. We heard today from the Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, who said that the U.S. is intrinsically unable to find compromises. So that is certainly setting the tone for any potential negotiations on the New START treaty. If anyone did think that it could be saved, it could be extended beyond its current expiry date of 2021. The Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia there suggesting that it might be very difficult. He says that it has been very difficult for the Russian Foreign Ministry to negotiate with the U.S. and to discuss new ideas on arms control. So there's certainly some fears that Europe could become a more dangerous place. That's certainly what we heard from Mikhail Gorbachev himself when he commented on the demise of this treaty. He says that this treaty made the world a safer place, and that without it, it's certainly in a more dangerous position.
All right, many thanks for that. Julia Chapman speaking to us from Moscow.